You're listening to Culture 360, the podcast that takes you inside the world of workplace and team culture. I'm Stu Savage, your host and guide, as we explore the ideas, people, and stories shaping the way we work, lead, and connect. So please subscribe, sit back, relax, and enjoy culture from every angle. Hello, good people, and welcome to the Culture 360 podcast in association with the Culture Room. I'm Stu Savage, culture consultant, and your host and guide for today's podcast. Well, this is a first. My fourth podcast is coming from windy Wellington. It's real windy today from home. Nice little setup in the house. And if you haven't listened to any of the previous podcasts, we did the first two in the UK. So if you go back and listen to podcasts 1 and 2 with Chris and Rob, they're now available online. And we've just published the third one with Dr. Andy Martin from Massey University, focused on the ABs and the sort of ferns. So please go and check those out. But today, we have a very special guest with me for episode 4, James Nelson, who is a consultant and trained counsellor and therapist. So I'm going to jump right in. James, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Stu.
I really want to tease out and jump into counselling, which is a very specialised role and subject. How do you get into counselling and where did you come from? Can you tell us a little bit, for the sake of the listener, your background and how you got to be in the role?
Sure, almost by osmosis, really, completely accidentally. I made coming here on the train, trying to recall the jobs I've done, and I'd lost count after 25. My school career, I was one of those students who I couldn't see a lot of point to school. Nobody could really tell me why I was there. So it was a relatively unsuccessful school career. So I jumped onto a building site and then into a shop and then worked in a legal office. And then I figured that all of these things weren't satisfactory. I started to realize I was more interested in people. So I trained properly initially as a residential social worker, which had a lot of therapeutic input in it. And I got interested in that and then worked at the sharp end for many years. I ran a children's home, and some of your listeners might know the Netflix series Adolescence. I worked in one of those centres for a couple of years. They were then called observation and assessment centres with a secure unit attached to it, and then found that all too overwhelming. I'm sure I had a lot of burnout as well as vicarious trauma, which I'll talk about. Spent some time gardening, farming, and working on a tree farm and doing other things like collected gold ingots, and then got bored with that. So trained as a teacher in the UK, did that for 5 years, and then emigrated to New Zealand 30 years ago and found the world of teaching just so different that I wasn't kind of good enough to make teaching a career. So I retrained as a resource teacher of learning and behaviour and didn't really like that, apart from the one-on-one psychology stuff. So then retrained as a counsellor and did a lot of work in schools. And then for the last 10 years, I'd run a private practice. It also came, honestly, through seeking some therapy myself, and initially in 2005, dealing with the homesickness / depression of leaving England and setting up here. You know, I didn't realize how much I'd been influenced subconsciously by this move. And I found that work transformational, actually sitting in front of someone who listened to me. I mean, I sat in front of people who didn't listen to me. So I moved on to counsellors until I found one who was empathetic and listener. Well, that's how I really got into it and found it was a career that filled me with meaning, really.
The whole theme, obviously, around the Culture Room and the Culture 360 podcast is to understand, firstly, how people think and behave within certain groups, certain workplaces, and to obviously try and fine-tune that. And I see a real value in terms of counselling, bringing some real learnings into that area, and probably want to just scratch the surface. But what does culture mean to you, James, in terms of, with a counselling hat on? What is organisational culture to you?
Yeah, I've thought about this and struggled to come up with a short definition. But the word that keeps coming up for me in relation to culture, if we're keeping countries and ethnicity out of it, is what is the atmosphere of a place when I walk into it? Part of my current role is to be called in as a consultant to help sort of directors, managers find out what's working well and what isn't. And I'm doing a little bit more of that work. And generally you get a feel for what the place seems like when you walk in the door. So it's what the atmosphere is and how people are behaving. Is there a lot of conflict or is there no conflict? The places that bother me are the places that seem too good to be true. I'd rather walk into a place where there's a bit of stuff obviously going on, rather than a kind of smiling culture where you're called in to help a small team, and the small team say, we've got absolutely no problems. They're the places I find more challenging, I think.
I do find like with some cultures, the real top ones, like the 1%, are very hard to break into to actually get a conversation like this to understand what's going on in the inner sanctum. And then the other end of the spectrum is the ones that you're trying to break into that there are problems and they don't want people to see behind the curtain. So there are two very extremes of why you can't break into some of those cultures. So my role is obviously to try to build trust and come into these environments and try to build a better, more connected, more inclusive, more effective environment.
Right.
When I've asked that question in the past, the stock standard answer for culture is generally the way we do things around here. And that seems to be the stock standard answer in a lot of scenarios or text or things that you read. For me, it's very much about like the way we think and the way we behave as animals, really, and in groups. Within one of the books, Culture Code by Dan Quayle, it talks about the 6 feet around you. So what are you bringing each day and how are you influencing people in that your bubble, if you like, in and around you? So very much about how we think and behave. From your perspective, what are your key roles and responsibilities, and what are the main things that you bring to a session when you're working with an individual, a couple, a group of people, youth, things like that? From the outside, you look at counselling and you think, well, it's very much about listening and empathy and support and trying to understand and unpack the issues that people are going through. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a pretty fair assessment. One of the first things I might do in an individual session, whether it's called consultation or counselling, and I think they are different things, is to sort of remind people of the parameters of privacy. Basically, when people talk to me on a one-on-one basis for a session, I always start with assuring that person in front of me that it is 100% confidential, apart from one or two very rare qualifiers. If I have a sense that there is some immediate and serious danger to life or limb, and say, well, whatever you say to me outside that parameter stays within these 4 walls. That's generally what I start with, and then move on, hopefully fairly quickly, into what a client's expectations / goals might be. It sounds simple, but I generally find people aren't able to articulate that straight away, that might tell you what they don't want. So so there's some work to be done on that. Reframing a goal, someone might say, well, I want to live without alcohol, but they don't know what the opposite of that is. So there's some time spent kind of reframing and redefining a goal. If I'm working with an individual who wants me to come into an organization, that conversation tends to be very wide-ranging. And again, you have to get a sense of, that might take 3 or 4 sessions to get a clear idea of what they're trying to develop in an organization. Whether it's, for example, it's more trust, more open dialogue, more productivity. It takes a while to get to something. And then we have to decide together whether or not I'm capable of delivering tools that might help.
So when you move in to obviously group environments, how do you've mentioned there that it takes 3 or 4 sessions to try and understand what's going on underneath the bonnet, if you like. How do you assess that? Is it very much, you talked about vibe and feel within an organization before and you get a feeling. very much, is it about observation, or is it a bit more technical than that? Do you actually use surveys or you interview people? Because what I've found is with some groups, they don't understand actually what's going on, either for themselves or within the group. You have to take a bit of time to understand and also build connection and trust.
Yeah, it can be very wide-ranging working with an organization. I mean, I do have a framework. The framework I was trained in was led by a professor at Massey, and it was called ARPI. And I think that framework has kind of been distilled since then. But that rough framework is to kind of listen, attend, personalize, and feed that back as a response, and then to suggest a possible initiating strategy. I confess I tend to forget that framework from time to time and, segue into things I've learned since. But yes, I'm always looking for kind of what one of the themes is what might be happening on top is the tip of the iceberg, but what's really happening underneath? Is there a lot of conflict or anger within a team? And if there is, what's happening to cause that, or what are people really feeling? That might be a thing we'll get to later. Is something that's very topical for me at the moment. Is anger as a sort of secondary manifestation, conflict as a secondary manifestation, and what's happening for people underneath that.
We've used phrases, in the past and leading up to this podcast around leaning in and understanding what's going on. In previous courses, people have said to me, look for what's underneath. And that was initially quite confusing, trying to understand, well, why am I happy or annoyed about this certain situation? And terminology in and around that. So I guess what you're trying to unpack there is listening and empathy and a little bit of EQ actually goes a long way to understanding what's happening for people and their peers and the groups that you work with.
Yeah, and I can sometimes go in at a level far too high for a client. After working with feelings for really all of my life, I can assume wrongly that people know what sadness is or what it feels like, and they may not. A client may report, I feel off today or puzzled or numb. So people often define a feeling that really isn't a feeling at all, but it might be a state or a thought. So I have to remind myself to connect with someone at a basic level if they're uncomfortable with a feeling. So, for example, a common presentation in these times is anxiety. People often present with, I'm feeling really anxious and it's keeping me awake at night, or I'm overwhelmed by feelings of terror. And getting to some more solid work on what that actually feels like in the body, there might be a lot of groundwork on that. Or from an organization, someone, a manager might report that, for some reason, we seem to have a culture of fear. Can you help us break that down? And I might need to interview individuals to get is going on there. And of course, an individual might say, oh, by the way, you're not going to feed this back to my manager, are you? So that's where you've got to be careful around confidentiality. You've got to ameliorate the feedback you're getting from individuals within a culture. And if the top really want that feedback, obviously you can't say, oh, by the way, person X thinks you're terrifying. You've got to soften that in such a way. It's a little bit like a 360 loop. That is that you want genuine feedback, but you've got to deliver it as clean feedback.
You think some organizations actually want that genuine feedback? I'm thinking about my own experiences within teams of 10 or 12 where you might have one person who's extremely aggressive and terrifying, and it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to work out like the feedback and who's been given it, and whether you actually trust the anonymity of the process. Is that a case?
I think that's an important question. I've had, for example, managers say to me, anonymous feedback is worthless. And I can see the sort of the central truth of that. But if you're getting feedback from people who are too scared to identify themselves, I can understand why they want to stay anonymous. up against the old chestnut here of how do you stand up to people who have power over you? And that can be unsafe in certain circumstances. And I think that's something you've got to deal sensitively with. I mean, one of the areas I'm currently working in is to, again, anger as a secondary emotion. How do you encourage people to feel and express vulnerability, but behave differently out of that primary emotion? And one of the answers to that for me is to deliver assertion training. So how do you get people to stand up for themselves in a good way without attacking others? But I always point out one of the risks of that is, I mean, if I'm, whether it's a counseling or a training situation, if I'm letting a client know what the rules of assertiveness are, I might be setting that person up to be in an unsafe situation. At an extreme sense, if I'm training the battered husband or wife or partner to stand up to the aggressor, I might be putting that person in harm's way. So I always try and point out, it's great to be assertive, but there are risks associated with that. I think the same thing applies to individuals as it does to organisations there.
Again, some of my thinking in and around this and study within organisations, bigger organisations that have HR managers and CEs have that close relationship because they have to. And it's almost like some of the processes that go on in organisations have to happen as a rule of thumb. And whether we actually want that genuine feedback, but as a group of staff or employees, there's not always that trust in terms of the organisation and feedback that you give and where it's going to go and how it's actually going to come out. And I've seen those things within organisations have been part of that, where you think, well, how genuine and direct do I want to be with this feedback, this 360 survey or a performance review, and where it lands and what the repercussions of that might be. I mean, is that a fair assessment of things you may have seen in the past?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment because although I've recently retired from the New Zealand Association of Counsellors, I was a full member of for many years. If you're a member of that organisation, you are ethically and legally bound by confidentiality. But it seems to me that in a lot of organizations, people promise to keep secrets, but in my experience, secrets leak out. People forget what they've promised. You know, word gets around. So I think even though the top of an organizational culture may want completely honest feedback, the participants giving that feedback, I think, need some assurance that it's not going to get leaked in a bad way. So that does happen quite a lot. So that's something I think to be aware of. I mean, this brings up to me the importance of, you know, when I was doing a lot more individual counseling or one-on-one therapy, really making clear the parameters of privacy. Because it seems to me there's a real paradox here. People need to be able to talk freely about what's really bothering them. And then how could I feel when I'm able to do that? The client might be asking themselves, well, can I tell this person in front of me that I feel really depressed, or I'm worried about hurting myself? You know, the person in my position is always assessing to see where the risk factors are. Because if you put too many barriers in place, you can talk about goal setting, but you're not allowed to talk about your depression because I'm going to tell someone if you do. You know, you need to be very, very clear about that. And I found working in a school with younger people, they were often brutally honest, for example, about what kind of lifestyle they were leading, but they were constantly saying, oh, I'm smoking, and will you tell my parents? And again, you have to have conversations. Well, how dangerous is smoking? I mean, all the science suggests that it's very dangerous, but it's not the same as playing with a loaded firearm. So you want to encourage the client to talk about something with privacy, but at the same time, you're hoping to get them along a continuum away from harm into more sort of pro-social, proactive behaviours.
I saw, in the second episode with Rob, he talks very much about youth wearing a mask and coming along to youth nights and not really opening up. But when they went off site on residentials or they go off on trips, then it was almost like the barriers came down and you were spending more time in their presence and would get to understand them a bit more, and they would talk about, something that was bothering them or something even worse. It's almost like we've taken that and put it into the workplace. And there's still this, because we're in these four walls within a building or in an office environment, there's certain taboo subjects, and we don't really want to drop our guard and open up for fear of reprisal. But then when you do take things, off site and you might do a workshop or team building exercise, it's almost like some of those guards come down a little bit. You see it in a sport analogy, certainly back in the day in the 70s, 80s and 90s, where people would go and have a drinking session because they felt that was team bonding away from the training ground. So I see those sort of trends, not just with youth, but it kind of emulates into the workplace too.
Yeah, and I often think, part of a counselling process is helping people rediscover unwitting repetition of patterns from their past. And I often remind myself that sometimes needs to be done in relationship with someone. I mean, the self-help industry with books is $1 billion industry. But my experience has been I can learn a lot from books, but it's not like talking to a person. And some of that stuff, I think, does need to be done in a relationship. And I was thinking about this morning on the train, is that when we think as children, we go to caregivers if we trust them because we want wisdom and guidance from them. So this comes back to our own experience, I guess, as children, is, are we allowed to tell our stories in the harbour of a safe relationship? I think kids learn to shut down when they don't feel it's safe to do that. So a lot of counselling training is involved with unlocking some of those unconscious patterns of behaviour. And does anyone come from a totally healthy family? I mean, I would say my argument is, well, probably not. A quote I would like to remind myself of is one by Alfred Adler. The only normal people are those you don't know very well. That's something I remind myself of, that I bring my prejudices to the consultation room. And who do I go to? Well, I have two clinical supervisors I work with to help unlock my unconscious processes. I mean, a client might bring up stuff for me that I'm having difficulty dealing with. It's only in consultation with my supervisors that I can shine a light on that stuff.
I think really what we're honing in on here is building a relationship through trust. And then a broad term that I keep coming across around safety. Simon Sinek talks about leaders eating last and building an environment of safety. And for him, leadership is very much about building a safe environment where people can fail off and fail forward and be safe to fail. And then we go into psychological safety, psychological, emotional, and physical safety. And then that for me bleeds into EQ and that big topic, which is very much in vogue since around 1995 with Dan Goleman, which talks about self-awareness and emotional regulation and social skills. And for me, leadership, not just understanding what staff need, but understanding themselves in becoming self-aware. So how do we build what for me is like the real nuts and bolts and basics is I want many things from my employer, but I would say psychological safety, emotional safety, physical safety are probably 101. They're the bedrock. And then we build from there. How do you see that, James?
Yeah, I echo that. As what I'm constantly trying to do as a therapist is to put a client at their ease so that they start to trust the process and feel safe with me. But I'm aware, of course, that doesn't come suddenly, and this brings up wider questions is, how do you know when you trust someone? Often I find clients build up to their vulnerabilities, and they're testing the ground by bringing up what might be a relatively minor issue and seeing how I deal with that. Because I think they're unconsciously scanning me to see, what can I tell him this? Is he going to collapse if I tell him this secret? And when they witness me not collapsing, they're safe to go on to the next big piece of work. I've certainly found that to be the case in my own therapy, even with supervisors that I trusted. Recollecting recently how I had a supervisory experience with someone for a long time, and I ended up telling my supervisor something that I realized I'd kept from her for 10 years, but it was nudging up. I feel as though it was something I needed to unpack with her, and I didn't know how she was going to receive it. And it made me realize, maybe I still don't trust this person, which was nothing to do with her and was everything to do with me. So I see that as a gradual process. One thing that worries me in modern times is the drive towards fixes and quick therapy. For example, selling CBT and the more postmodern cognitive behavioral therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy. They're wonderful, but I find myself as I age wanting to get more and more back to psychoanalytical processes. Where does this come from? How have I been affected in this way? And the deep need to find unconscious patterns is something I'm very, very invested in. But again, it's a little bit like the football teams that we follow, the tendency to get rid of manager after manager without really looking at why the results aren't coming. What's happening, you say, within the team, within the culture of the place.
Mm.
So as I age, I tend to want to get back to the roots of things, which is, I'm aware, counter to the culture of modernity, which is, here's the problem, fix it, move on to the next one, which is the same attitude I think people have towards their own anxiety. So I've got this anxiety and it's a terrible thing in itself. It's helping me to fix problems. Let's just focus on the problems. And we can do that. But what I found with anxiety is, if you just fix the problems that we're anxious about, the anxiety will just attach itself to the next problem. For me, the real work is getting into relationship with one's anxiety, not about making it disappear or just using it to solve problems. Is that when did that first come into your life?
So talking about trauma and dealing with people that have had events in their life and they keep resurfacing.
Yes.
Something that I've been revisiting, and it's on the blog as well if people want to go and read it. It's one of the first entries I made around the chimp paradox, which I keep coming back to because for me it's just so relative. And Steve Peters, who's a sports psychiatrist, talks about the different processes in the brain. And certainly something that's interested me and also helped me is understanding how my own brain works. And we all have one. And the majority of us, we're in a position where we could probably do some reading or some understanding of how we actually process things within our own mind and the different parts of the mind, prefrontal cortex, limbic center, parietal part of the brain, how they all interact. And understanding when it's going on for you. I also think as a human being, I can understand or step back when things are happening for me. But the next part of that is, what tools do I have to actually address it? And that's something I think you've really hit on there, James, is firstly, self-awareness and understanding what's going on for you and leaning into it. But then, do you have the tools to deal with it? And I guess that's where people like yourself come in.
Yes. And hopefully one can help people with those tools. But at the same time, or at least I realize that I sometimes don't have the tools to deal with it. Trauma is such a massive area, highly specialized, and we're constantly learning more about trauma and what it is. So I have simple acronyms that I use to help me ground me when I'm listening to trauma stories. Thank goodness I'm not trained as a psychiatrist. I don't think I was ever bright enough to become a doctor. But psychiatrist's stock and trade, of course, is to assess, diagnose, and then prescribe. And I just don't want to be in that world. I'm more interested in personal narratives. I was looking at some statistics on the train this morning when diagnosis first came into the mental health field. I believe in about 1952, and I may be wrong about that, when the psychiatrist manual, the DSM, was put together. There were 106 diagnoses in 1952. The number of diagnoses had more than doubled. And I don't know how many there are in there now. I think we're currently on the DSM-5. Thank goodness that isn't part of my brief, is to know the DSM-5. I've become more interested as I age in human stories underneath trauma. Although I think knowing about trauma in my field is essential.
So narrative, and again, something on the blog, I was reading the book Sapiens, and Harari talks about how human beings are different to the animal kingdom because we have imaginations and we can tell stories. And I think that is really powerful. And you will obviously have people come into your practice, or you'll deal with people in workshops, and they will tell stories and attach meaning to them.
The more I learn about trauma, the more I conclude that trauma is not just lodged in the way we think, not just lodged in the brain. It gets stuck in our bodies and central nervous systems and has a tendency to become unconscious. A story I became aware of in my own life recently, when I was recently been asked to deliver a presentation and couldn't kind of get the topic right between the people who wanted me to do it and what I was able to do. And I eventually decided to do something which I feel sort of passionate about, is anger as a secondary emotion. And we ended up agreeing on that because it was something I thought I didn't have to put weeks and weeks of prep in. But I still found myself driving down to this venue, getting more and more anxious and nervous about it. And the more I asked myself when I was about to deliver, gosh, this shouldn't feel this terrifying. What's going on for me? I wasn't really sure on the day. I delivered the presentation, and one of the most interesting parts of the day for me was when you're delivering to 40 or 50 highly trained people. I'm very aware that the audience can possibly know collectively far more than I do. When I got back home, and there were no disasters, I hope, I got some good feedback. I stayed at the end for some impromptu feedback. I had a notification on my watch that said, your resting heartbeat rose to 127 BPM whilst you were seemingly inactive. And I looked at the timing of this, and this is when I was presenting. And of course, I must have felt terrified, but I was aware of not letting the audience know that. But the watch had picked it up, and it had registered the fact that my heart was racing. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. What's going on for me here when I stand up in front of people? I was reading some research recently that said it's people's biggest fear is the idea of being humiliated publicly. And I certainly relate to that. What I find constantly illustrating is, well, I ask myself, well, why should I be scared of public speaking? And I searched and searched for deeper triggers. I'm always looking for triggers underneath triggers. And this is where I can self-disclose. I came back to a story of when I must have been 6 years old, and probably like a lot of people from England, went to a fairly bog standard working class primary school that was pretty tough. I'm going back to the days of the early 60s where teachers were legally able to brutalize kids and, hit them legally. And that didn't bother me so much. But there was an incident occurred when, in my day, coming from what we would then call a broken home was quite rare. And there was a lot of stigma around parents who were separated. And I don't know what happened on this day, but this teacher felt she had permission to get me to stand up at the front and talk about how boys from broken homes often had dirty necks. And she pointed out to me as an example of this. And it was a complete and utterly terrifying humiliation. And I remember going home and telling my dad, who I was living with, this teacher got me to stand up and talk about why I've got a dirty neck. And as I worked through why my heart rate might be doubling when I was presenting, I discovered it all went back to that, something I hadn't uncovered in my own personal therapy. I don't know whether that answers the question, but I guess the answer to the question is there's always more to find out. Keep looking, keep trying to know yourself. I mean, the more you can uncover your unconscious processes, the more you get to know yourself and the more authentic you can show up in the world.
It's a really interesting analogy. And to go back to the processes in the brain, do you think that's something that sits within your memory in your parietal part of your brain? And that fear comes up because the triggers, the stimuli, you're going on stage to talk in front of 100 people. And all of a sudden, the limbic part of the brain looks into the parietal brain. Do we have anything in here in the memory? Oh shit, that happened when I was 6. And now this is coming up for me.
Yeah. And you sometimes are not aware of that at the time. What you're aware of is bodily sensations. One of my early trainers in an online forum was a guy called Peter Levine, who did a lot of very good work early with trauma and over a 50-year period. I remember one of his training seminars pointed out that animals are really good at processing trauma and human beings have forgotten how to do it. And some of his research, I think, focused on how he'd observed in focus groups like herd of gazelles on the veldt. If they heard a loud noise, they were observed, the herd was observed. You could see the tremble go through the herd. And the animal was really good at moving the body around to shake off a fear. When the lead deer or antelope or whatever it was realized it was just a stick breaking and not a predator, they would shake the body out and relax. Whereas as human beings, I think we're particularly coming from England, you're trained to seem calm and present the stiff upper lip. But inside, one is aware of one's own nervous system acting up. I don't know about anyone else, but I know when my anxiety presents, there's a clamminess in the hands. If the anxiety ramps up further, I notice the hair on my back of my neck standing up. I notice my pulse, my heart rate. I might even start talking more quickly. For me, working with a therapist is about getting to know that and what the brain's doing. Something I think which has a piece of gold for everyone is that the amygdala, there are two of them, the limbic system still doesn't really know the difference between a tiger and a hostile email, or a person who's talking at the back of the room, or a person who says, you're a terrible trainer. The limbic system will do what it does. It will send fight or flight chemicals around the body. I mean, the more we can know about that, the better, I think. So there's a lot of psychoed to be done on the central nervous system. I didn't learn any of that at school.
Some of this feeds back to another blog article that we posted a few months ago around emotions and EQ. We started to unpack the pros and cons of that, either in teams and in the workplace, and how much of each we need, and what the benefits and the disadvantages are of both. And within one of those articles, Adam Grant, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who's a specialist in organisational psychology, talks about, I'll read you the quote here, mental health is not about being happy all the time. It's about learning to handle the full range of emotions. It's normal to feel grief after loss, anger at injustice, and fear of danger. Resilience lies in putting our feelings in perspective instead of letting them define us. And then further down in the article, Susan Grant talks about seeing emotions as information, not directives. So why are we feeling the way we're feeling? And I think that keeps coming back to what we spoke about before, the processes in the brain, being self-aware of what is going on for us, and then trying to unpack and understand why. And then finally, what can we actually do about it? So you being on stage is, it's anxious, it's fear-inducing, but you understood why it was happening. And then what could you do about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question that has, I think, a complicated answer. It seems to me that we need strategies to help how anxiety comes into our lives, I think basically it comes into our lives, our bodies, our brains in two different ways. We've got the kind of jump scare, quick pathway to fear, terror, anxiety. We're crossing a road and the green man is on and a car comes out of nowhere and almost runs us over. A very, very quick, a split second where your body just reacts, freezes and does what it does. I think we need strategies to combat that amygdala-driven anxiety. But then there's the other type of anxiety that might have the same result, where we're lying awake at 3 a.m. worrying about a presentation. It comes back to us when we least want it, when we should be sleeping. So it's almost like we need a lot of body-based strategies for the amygdala jump scare stuff. This is where the global mindset around now is mindfulness, staying in the present, touching what's real, breathing, getting fully exercises like grounding and focusing. These are all, I'm throwing these techniques as if they're simple, but what, hopefully as a counselor, you're trained in some of these things, helping the immediate rush of adrenaline, but then also more cognitive strategies to rein in anxiety that's produced by overthinking or types of thinking. But balanced against that, of course, again, the danger there is putting sticking plasters on. Again, which worries me a little bit. All you need is 3 sessions of CBT and you'll never be worried about anything again. I'm not saying anyone sells that as a package, but I'm wary of that. I always like, for example, when I found at my recent presentation where I discovered that deep trigger, it wasn't until the next day that I discovered that. And for me, that's just useful information for me. Yeah, I think we do need strategies to help us feel our feelings, but we don't want to be acting out of those feelings all of the time. Some of those feelings need challenging, because feelings, just like thoughts, can tell lies. The example I like to give is if I'm coming back to a dark, empty house late at night, if I don't turn the light on and see a dark shape, my body's going to react. If I turn the light on and see it's just a coat, I realize my body's preparing me for something that isn't really there. It might just be some crazy person with an axe, but I won't go to bed and not turn the light on, right? It's the same way as when someone wants to unpack their anxiety. To me, it's like, well, let's turn the light on. Let's have a look at the monsters under the bed. I think it's the wise parent who does that rather than say, don't be silly, there's nothing there. Logically, the child wants proof of that. So I think that's something we can continue to do as adults, is to explore our vulnerability, to sort of model that.
Yeah, and they do that really well on the silver screen, don't they? In terms of manipulating your emotions and your fears.
For sure.
You watch a horror movie and your mind's active, and you get home and you're locking the doors. I know I've done it. Yeah, there was a film to go off piece here, a Korean horror movie called Exuma. If you don't like scary movies, don't watch it. If you do, you'll love it.
Yeah.
I think I went home and locked all the doors and, checked under the bed and in the cupboards. And
Yeah.
It's crazy how like your brain and your emotions can actually lie to you. And to go back to what you were talking about, meditation and mindfulness, are we our thoughts and feelings? Because sometimes they can actually conjure things up that aren't there, and aren't real, but we build this narrative in our head and dramatize and catastrophize whatever's going on for us and build it up to be something that it isn't. So it's interesting. I found it really engaging and interesting how the human brain can actually build these things up. And I want to try and draw it back now to families and groups and tribes and our organization and our teams, is how we bring some of this into our lives, what tools we can use. Because part of what we do with the culture room is firstly understanding self, then understanding peers, then understanding either our team or our group or whatever we sit in within our organization, and then understanding if it's relative, customers, stakeholders, participants, if it's a sport. So those 4 key strands. So what tools do we have in the box, James? Is it very much about firstly control yourself, control the controllables, or understand yourself, I should say, before we actually start to understand our peers and then the group that we sit in? And something we've mentioned as well as previous to the podcast was around values and values within an organization and the desired behaviors within those values and how we want to think and behave and be seen within our teams. So there's a lot to go at there, I know.
Yeah, I think to your first point, for me, understanding always comes before control. This, I guess, goes back to, put it simply, what one of Freud's early theories was the superego, ego, and the id, where the id is a subconscious dark thing with childhood drives and desires, not a bad thing, but the using the superego being the kind of rules of parents and society and the church, and the ego is yourself, maybe untrammeled by those two things. You know, the idea of talking through something with a professional is to get the stuff out of the id into the ego so that we become more aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I would say understanding is always better than control, because the more we understand something, maybe the more we can do something about it. And I've forgotten the second part of your question.
So we talked about understanding self and then understanding peers, understanding the group that we're in. And then it might be about our stakeholders or our customers or our participants. So they were the four strands to what we try to work on in the organization. And then understanding self. Firstly, can we control or understand or control the controllables?
Yeah. And I guess that's what I would say, as moving off Freud, but getting onto Jung, where they divided, was something I always remember from Jung's work was the unconscious is always unconscious. That this idea that, yeah, you can bring stuff up, hoping to understand yourself, get far more awareness of yourself by talking about yourself, your life, and your stories. There's always going to be an unconscious piece that we're not sure of. You know, we can never maybe know ourselves totally, but my view is you can keep working towards it. I mean, me wondering about why my body was reacting so violently after what ought to have been a simple presentation was new learning for me. And that helps me. It makes me aware of my vulnerabilities. And what might also help next time when I want to know what a brief is for some training, that might help me to say no to deliver something I don't know much about, because, always seeking for more understanding. But you can never get to the end of it. And I guess that brings up for me why I've chosen this work. To me, it's like the ultimate three-dimensional matrix. You can never get to the end of it. You can never know yourself totally. In terms of values within a culture, values is a really interesting word for me because I've only grappled with that of late. I mean, when I was a young man, I don't think I had many coaching values. I mean, I remember as a 20-year-old wanting to travel and meet people, I didn't think I'd sort of define my world in terms of values. Now I equate values with qualities rather than goals. My values when I was 20 were very sparse. I wanted to go around lots of Greek islands and meet people. I didn't really care too much about others. It's only lately I've got into values-based work, and I think it's incredibly valuable, something that acceptance and commitment therapy espouses, that, well, it's really good to find out what your values are, because once you know those values, then you can bring in tools to help people move towards them. There's a great little tool by, I'm not sure whether Russ and Benjamin invented it, but Russ Harris is a great guy for acceptance and commitment therapy who put in front of us this tool called the choice point. This idea that we identify our values, we can move towards them more regularly. I find these little micro tools, organizations might not have heard of, but they find them really useful. So, I mean, they want something really solid rather than, well, how can we move towards this value? If one of our values we're trying to develop is kindness, how do we move towards that? So tools like the choice point can help with that. And I agree, picking up what you said earlier. I mean, everyone wants to be happy. But as Russ Harris has pointed out, a book he's written called The Happiness Trap, it's like, well, it's a vague term. I think happiness is a side effect of finding out what your values are and trying to move towards them more regularly. This is bearing in mind the fact that we all move away from our values. And it's good to know how and why we do that.
To go back to the analogy where we were talking about dealing with the self, I think it's on your point as well, is to understand what your beliefs and values are and how they affect you, whether it's good or bad. And most people listening to this might not understand actually individually what their values are. And through this work, what we're trying to do is unpack the individual so you understand what your beliefs and values are, touched on emotions before and why we behave the way we do and what's important to us. But then how does that affect our peers? So what are our peers' values and beliefs, and do we align? And if we do, great. And if we don't, then how do we work with that? As a collective, as a group, what are the collective then values of the organisation? And do we agree with them? And if we don't, how do we manage that? And if we do, then what do those behaviours and actions look like? And then we try to put obviously rituals within the organisation, day-to-day 1% plays of how we reinforce the behaviours that we want to see and hear and feel. So for me, it was very much about what are my values? Because a lot of people just won't understand, what are they? I have asked certain people in the past, and some people can reel them off, and some people have not got a clue. And it's something I visited through my own learnings as well, like what are my values and beliefs? And have they helped me or hindered me? Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, I came to values work late, and being, I think, a relatively slow learner, what I needed was a list of value-based words, to help me kind of clarify, well, I put down money, that's not really a value. For me, it was like figuring out, it was great for me to have a list of 200 words so I could pick the things out for me. Like I realized as I aged and moving towards sort of semi-retirement and doing less work, that words like kindness became more important. Whereas it wouldn't be a word I might have embraced as a young man, but then tracing back my counseling career, I started to realize, in fact, kindness was something I valued as a child. I remember once another personal story. It must have been to do with my parents' divorce and everything that happened there. I went off to school one day and was just utterly miserable and wretched. Didn't know anything about grief or loss or that kind of change process that now hopefully I know a lot more about. And I remember as a little boy sitting on this concrete step, just being really upset. And this kid came along who, he was kind of an enemy, not a friend. But he came up to me, sat down with me, put his arm around my shoulder and said, "What's up?" And I immediately felt better. It was like, oh, someone cares. So having said, I didn't really care about kindness, maybe in telling that story, maybe I always did, but lost that. That's become, when people ask me the question, why did you become a counselor? It maybe is deeper than I think. It's having that experience of someone who actually cares about you. So something that I think clients ask me, when they tell me a story or a secret, well, I'm telling you this, but do you care? These are the bigger questions in life. I mean, if you're working with an organization who just wants to sell a product, you've got to ask, well, what are they selling a product at all costs, even though they know it's effective? Hopefully most organizations aren't like that. That's where I think value-based work is really effective. Or why are we selling this, and do we really believe in it?
Mm. You would buy a product off the strength of the values of the organisation. I remember reading a book about Volkswagen cars and how they built this reputation for being solid, reliable cars with the Beetle in the 60s, and then building that reputation. And obviously, drove Volkswagen myself, probably 3 or 4 different cars over the years because of that value and reputation that you perceive. Not to say that things don't go wrong with those cars, they do, trust me. But you buy it off the strength of the values of the organisation, things reliable or well built, and we think that about nations. And if you buy something from Germany or Japan, it's going to work quite well and nothing will ever go wrong with it. And it's how we build again those narratives that you were talking about before. It's the perceived value of the organisation and why you buy into that. Is it a quality product?
Yeah, I remember as an English teacher, what one had to be clued up on static images and advertising, and I realised my own ignorance. I mean, when I was a young father, watching adverts for nappies on television, I mean, that totally hooked me in. I thought, oh, this is going to be a breeze. Well, I soon realised that the advert was not real at all. Incredible ignorance on my part, but. Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to this constant desire for authenticity and truth. One of the things as a counsellor that it is in the New Zealand Code of Ethics is that you're not really allowed to help anyone have an unethical goal or value. And that has happened occasionally in my career, where you might have had someone come and say, oh, I love stealing and I want you to help me be a better thief, is a brief you have to refuse because it's not aligned with general legal ethics. That hasn't happened very often, but I'd like to think that if I work with an organization, if I find my values are totally at odds with the organization, then maybe I'm not the person to help them with that brief. I've not yet come across a situation like that, but one day it could happen. Yeah.
Just moving on here, James, from a counselling perspective, what does a good or great organisation or a relationship look like for you? And you can answer this and then we'll attack it in any way versus a toxic environment. And then what would your advice be for people that are in an environment that's either good, great, indifferent, terrible, and if they wanted to try and make things better either for themselves or the organisation? What's your advice from a counselling perspective?
Well, advice is, it's a loaded word. Advice isn't counselling. It can be given in counselling. I would say that my advice is always get to know yourself better. Lift the lid on yourself. That to me is always a way forward. It's something I'm still striving to do, even in my mid to late 60s, is find out more about yourself. Man, know thyself, it is enough for thy little life, as one of the classics, right, may have been Socrates. Keep pushing towards that. Keep uncovering yourself. That would be the principal piece of advice if I was forced to give advice. And don't be scared of your vulnerabilities. I think there's a whole, still in this day and age, although I think men are coming a long way, but men specifically are up against the cultural be strong, don't show your feelings bit. But that isn't dangerous to me. It's becoming more comfortable with your own vulnerabilities.
Just to interject, what do you think it is about males where they don't want to engage with their emotions and EQ? Do you think that either the product doesn't exist to draw that out within, or is it the way we think and behave as men, and we really need to start looking at how we change our behaviours?
Yeah, and I think that started, but there's a lot more to be done. Recently, talking to a group about the messages we receive from culture generally, the media. I mean, I remember growing up with TV series like Hill Street Blues. The motif every time, was it Captain Furillo? It was, I seem to remember there was a saying, let's do it to them before they do it to us. That was what being a male was like, was don't be weak. Play on with a broken leg. I mean, this stuff seems crazy to me now. I think we're still, as men, assailed by these images, but the tide is turning slightly, and long may that continue. I find counselling men is when they feel safe in a consulting room and are able to expose their deepest fears, sadnesses, and vulnerabilities. I think it's really fulfilling seeing men move from that stoic position. It's always very humbling and very, very humane finding these moments when a man can sit in front of you. Is it okay for me to break down? I think in my early days, I had experiences with very, very tough men who there's nothing sadder than seeing a grown man trying not to cry, but even using the words weeping or crying was difficult. But I remember a guy saying, "Don't worry, I'm not crying. My eyes are leaking." To me, that's very, very moving when you can create an atmosphere where someone can grieve properly, for example.
Yeah. And you can take that in any direction, can't you? And you look at different generations gone by, wartime, hardship, different countries and nations and how they manage their actions, behaviours and their feelings,
Yes.
but also industries. I mean, when I've done work with groups and teams, you look at like, at one end of the scale, you've got the military, small percentages. If you a fraction of percentage off, you could die or somebody else could get killed. Operation goes to custard, and the way we manage that is very process-driven, plan, pray, don't show your feelings, right through to the other end, which no offense, let's say Google, for example, are very much about well-being and people orientation and winning awards for having very focused environments on people and well-being. So to me, it's like a sliding scale, and where we want to sit within how we want to manage our organizers. Sometimes it's in the middle. We want safe environments where people can connect and it's inclusive, but also sometimes from the employer's point of view, we need to get the job done.
Yes.
You're paid to do a job. This is the contract. These are your roles and responsibilities. So we're going to need to see some KPIs and get that done. And it's a balance, really.
It is a balance and a difficult one. And I think, how do you support someone who's not performing? To me, one of the answers to that is concerned, human-centered, empathic coaching. We notice you're struggling. What can we do to help you get over this stumbling block? One of the sad statistics I often think about, going back to the military and having counseled a few military veterans, not too many, is that at the end of the Vietnamese, I may be wrong about this, so I may need to further look at this statistic. My understanding was that of the 50-odd thousand people, young American soldiers who were killed in the Vietnamese War, when that war ended, more soldiers killed themselves after the war ended because of the lack of support. So these guys were amazingly efficient at what they did on the battlefield. But when the battles ended and they came home, then the feelings came out. And if they're not supported, it can be overwhelming. So yeah, getting that balance is absolutely essential, I think. And I always ask people to, for example, if you're working, say, with a teacher who's sick of teenagers, asking that teacher to remember what it was like for them as a teenager, what helped them. I mean, I remember some really awful teachers, but I also like to remember the teachers who genuinely went out of their way to help me. And I'm always trying to unpack, what was it about them that enabled me to connect with school? And generally, it was a sense of them being really interested in my welfare and well-being. They seemed to really care. Now, I think there were more teachers back in the 60s who didn't rather than did. But I'm forever grateful for the teacher or the couple of teachers who took me under their wing. And I think we need more of that. Values in the workplace, empathy of cultures of empathy, kindness and caring. But you're right, the balance, you can have all that, but you've got to get the tasks done. Yeah, absolutely.
I guess that comes back to our Stone Age brain and being part of the tribe or not, and being excluded. And we're still thinking I think it was that quote, we've got Neolithic brains, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
Yes.
And you look at those three things all being an issue of the way we think and behave at the moment. The way our brains, obviously, if you're ostracized or excluded from a group, or to coin a kid's phrase, FOMO, fear of missing out. That's a very real thing.
Yeah, and I think that goes way back to our early roots as humans. Being isolated as a vulnerable human would mean death. I like one of my father figures is Irvin Yalom, the great existential psychotherapist, who often points out, the four fundamental existential concerns that the human race has. It is freedom, isolation, meaning, and death. And I think they're all connected. Yeah, we're constantly working out how not to be alone. And I think organizations and organizational culture can do some great work in that area. You know, if this person over here is not feeling part of a team, how can we get them to feel part of a team? What support can we give them? Rather than sort of punitive measures. Thankfully, we're moving away from that, you know.
There's another conversation you've hit on there around a sense of belonging, community and connection.
Mm,
It's
mm,
something we're trying to, on the podcast, we're going to unpack around education in the UK,
mm.
how we build that within school environments or school climates and education.
A sense of belonging.
Yeah,
Mm,
and children or youth having that disconnect and not feeling part of the tribe and part
mm,
of the group, because medieval institutions, again,
mm,
are they fit for purpose, and do children come to this place we call a school,
mm.
and we have a diverse group, but they don't always see value or want to be there because they don't feel connected and they don't feel part of the group hug?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's a whole other area. But I remember coming to New Zealand and being involved in tomorrow's schools and cooperative learning. I mean, my school days were so different where, like, right, pick someone to sit next to, or two teams who are going to have a game of football. Always being the kid who was left out. You know, it was a terrible feeling. Whereas I was really staggered by some of the things that was happening in New Zealand is that you get a sort of teacher selected group so that no one felt excluded. I thought that was really revealing and healthy. I've been out of education for a while, so I've got no idea where those movements and trends are. But I remember that getting involved in cooperative learning strategies to me was a great way to make sure everyone was included. So no one was sort of, you know, in my school days, there was always the kid who was left out of the football team, or the kid who had no one to sit next to. And being that kid myself on a few occasions, not always, it's a terrible feeling when you're not feeling included. It's great, I think, when organizations can be inclusive.
And when you have observations, I mean, I've worked in community sport for 20, 25 years. There's no great myth, really. Like, the kids want to have fun.
Mm,
They want to play with their mates.
mm,
You know, now and again, the parents probably want them to learn something, some skills or some development. And some kids want competition because they're
mm,
competitive.
mm,
But generally, they're the things that happen. And
mm,
if you have a fun environment where they play with their mates, they'll feel connected and part of the group. And you just use the analogy there, getting picked last in football.
mm,
And that's because you felt ostracized from
mm,
the group. And again, your Neolithic brain's
mm.
kicking in and telling you that you're probably going to die because of this.
Yeah.
It's that anxiety inducing.
That is, yeah. And I think for me, what I found going back to my teaching days, actually that kids learn if they're having fun. I think that's true. But feeling safe is more important, I think. Unless you've got a safe classroom, then there's no fun and they're not going to learn. You know, so that's paramount. I'm constantly looking at ways that organizations can induce safety because I think relative safety is something we all need. I don't believe in absolute safety. I mean, an acronym when I'm working with trauma, more common than not, an acronym that helps me in my mind is CGTM. And an acronym, it's not linear, but the C stands for create a sense of relative safety in the present. Might be in the consulting room, and that might not happen instantly. The G stands for helping someone gain a sense of control. The T is to tell the story of the trauma in the harbour of a safe relationship, or as much as the client wants to. And the N is mourning the losses created by the trauma. I've segued onto specific trauma work, but I think if we dredge our childhoods for stories of when we felt frightened in school, you could fill several hundred textbooks. You know, if I felt safe, then I could learn and I could also have fun.
Okay. One of the things we really focus on at the Culture Room is rituals and how we implement them, whether it's a team or workplace organisation, and the 1% plays that we do day on day that make traditions, but also help people within groups and teams. So, for example, one of the teams that I worked in, we would have a ritual of we're hardwired to go below the line and sometimes be a little bit negative and have a bit of a whinge and find things that were wrong.
Mm.
It's always easy to focus on that 1% that's wrong rather than 99% that's right. So we had a ritual where we could have a little whinge, but we would have to come back with a solution and go back above the line. I've got a quote by Aristotle here, James. It says, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit." So that speaks to me of having habits and rituals in the workplace that reinforce good behaviours, good actions, and obviously lead to positive outcomes and performance. What's the one thing that we're not talking about? The one left field idea, something that's a burning issue for you, a light bulb moment throughout your career that from a counselling perspective, we're either not doing in our lives, in our relationships, or in our workplace?
Yeah, there's probably one or two things I do, and it's to do with it. Again, it's not unrelated to knowing more about yourself. I mean, I've worked in teams where the morning rituals and habits aren't great for me, whether it's a floor talk or a morning briefing. You sit there totally disengaged from what's happening. Now, as an individual, what I find always makes my day less scary. Say I'm facing a 7-client day, which can be terrifying. I will remind myself constantly to stay in the present. So the breathing, the grounding, the touching the present is something I constantly try and do. And I also might add a mantra to that, something I might say to myself. So rather than traditionally, my scared part might say, "Oh my God, 7 people today. What have I got for them? Nothing." I might just say to myself, I'm going to have a series of encounters today, a series of meetings. It immediately calms down that scared part of me that's always going to be there. I'm not trying to get rid of it. I'm acknowledging its fear, but I'm just kind of helping it negotiate those difficult moments. And yeah, I love that quote. It reminds me, I think it was Stephen Covey borrowed it, a great book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You know, the importance of practice and habit. We are what we repeatedly do. I remember that absolutely. I think it's very easy for us as individuals to do one thing on one day, think we've got it, and then not do it the next day. I know for me, being a relatively slow learner, I've just got to keep doing that. You know, my terror of meeting 7 different people might never go away. But if I constantly help it by saying, you're going to have a series of encounters, it just gets easier.
I think that's a really good way to link well-being, counselling and culture. And to wrap up this really intriguing and enjoyable podcast. So I want to thank you for being part of it today, being part of the Culture 360 podcast.
Thank you, Stu. Yeah.
Sharing your time and knowledge with us. It's always good to see you. Thank you, James.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stu.
If you enjoyed the Culture 360 podcast, and like me, you geek out on leadership and organisational culture, then please smash a like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Also, if you have any feedback or ideas, or you'd like to get in touch, then please connect with the Culture Room at thecultureroom.co.nz or on our various social media platforms. Thanks for listening.